Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are about to get started on day 9. Thank you for joining us. We're going to tune in our Facebook Live audience in just a second. But as you know, we are continuing our reading for Chaos or Community with MLK. And that book is Why We Can't Wait, was the first book. And we are continuing on with Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. So I'm going to go live now with our Facebook Live audience as well. Welcome, 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 welcome. It is day 9 of Chaos or Community. Where do we go from here? And we are on live today with our YouTube audience as well. So if you see me looking back and forth, that is what I am doing. We are on day 9 of Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Where do we go from here, chaos or community? And yesterday we left off talking about doctrines from hell, and MLK began to give the beginning and kind of the basis of some of the issues that we are facing in the United States even today, based on the ideology that was set up in this country from its inception, in terms of slavery, in terms of that whole justification for enslaving human beings. And so we're going to pick up right at where he's talking about the doctrines from hell, as I call them. So thank you all for joining live. If you can, share this broadcast on your page. And I'm going to take a few minutes here to invite some of my fellow followers in. So again, thank you all for joining live. If this broadcast should cut short, I will try to restart it on Facebook Live. So if you see it cut off, just give me a moment and I will try to come back on as soon as possible. We haven't been having any problems with our live stream through YouTube, so these videos are being archived there, and they are running continuously. So even if you guys cut off, the videos on YouTube are still running. My YouTube channel is Church Love 333. And if you are new to my broadcast and you'd like to know what I do for a living, who I am, etc., I am, as they say, Googleable. So you can check out other things that I do online. But that is not my goal today. My goal today and in these broadcasts is to simply enlighten you. All right, so we're back. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And we are on day 9, Doctrines of Hell in the USA. And MLK is now going to kind of talk about those doctrines and let you know from the perspective of what was happening with the presidents and how were these doctrines really being solidified in our society to the point where we still have some of these issues today. Yesterday, for example, well, let me just pray first before I continue. Let me just pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness and your grace. Thank you, Lord God, for each and every person, God, that will come on this broadcast, Father, that they will have a mind to hear, that they will have ears to hear, eyes to see what your spirit is saying, and a heart that's open to receive even truth that they may not have heard before. Father God, we just come against cognitive dissonance, Father, that idea that makes us want to distance ourselves from the truth because of what we've been taught or what we've already learned, Father. I pray, God, that you would break every glass ceiling in our mind, break every spirit of ignorance in Jesus' name. And Father, let your light and let your truth come in Jesus' name. Give us, oh God, your wisdom, your knowledge, and your understanding. so that we may serve and help our generation. In Jesus' name, amen. So yesterday evening, I was reading a post of my cousin who has two beautiful daughters, and it really disturbed me because I don't know if this was like their first time encountering anybody with racist ideology, but her two daughters, very young, were being addressed by another little girl, Caucasian girl, who proceeded to tell them that all the black people were killing all of the white people. And this little girl said it to them several times. And then she said, and you all are just like them. Now, we can say that part of that ideology may have come through something that these young girls are watching on television. But the reality is, children only talk like that when they hear it from adults. So this goes back to what we're talking about today, about ideology that has to be dealt with in our country because it continues to be perpetuated. And it continues to be perpetuated generation after generation after generation. It's hard to get rid of something if every generation is perpetuating their own version of it. So yesterday we started out and MLK began talking about racism and how, and I'll read it again, one of the quotes that he shared yesterday. It says, racism is a faith. It is a form of idolatry. And he talks about how to justify what was happening in America with slavery, with the dehumanization of people, that the idea of superior race was heightened and deepened in meaning so that it pointed beyond the historical structures of relation in which it emerged to human existence itself. So this doctrine was solidified and carried out intentionally because there was a benefit in using people as economy. And so because that conflicted with people's moral thought, they began to do things like utilize the Bible to try to justify something that was immoral, even though it was making people a lot of money, right? He goes on, he went on to say, slavery was not only ignored in defining democracy, but its enlargement was tolerated in the interest of strengthening the nation. So people knew that they were going against their conscience, and they had to figure out a way for them to continue to go against their conscience in order to continue this practice, in order to keep making the money that they were making. All right. So that's where we left off. And then, as he said here, logic was manipulated to give intellectual credence to the system of slavery. Someone even formulated the argument for the inferiority of the Negro in the shape of a syllogism. And that syllogism said, all men are made in the image of God. God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro. Therefore, the Negro is not a man. And so they were building a doctrine. They were building a doctrine that we can keep doing this. We can keep justifying slavery because we've now established this doctrine that the Negro is not a man. And good morning to those of you who are watching. And most of us don't seem to understand that this ideology still exists in the United States. That the Negro is not a man, that the black person is not a man. You don't see it as blatant and as intentional, but it is still there. This doctrine is still there. So let's continue our reading for today. Academians eventually climbed on the bandwagon and gave their prestige to the myth of the superior race. Their contribution came through the so-called Teutonic origins theory. That's Teutonic, Teutonic origins theory, a doctrine of white supremacy surrounded by the halo of academic respectability. So now you have academics or people who are supposed to be about the business of educating people on the truth are now coming up with their own white supremacist doctrines and theories of origin to try to give credence to something that is false. A lot of times when we hear the term false doctrine, we automatically think church, or we think Christianity. But there's a lot of false doctrines going on around in our world. The theorists of this concept argue that all Anglo-Saxon institutions of any worth had their historical roots in the Teutonic tribal institutions of ancient Germany. Excuse me. And furthermore, that only the Teutonic race had been imbued with the ability to build stable governments. So here it is. They're basically saying, if you are of ancient Germanic origins, you are the creme de la creme, right? You are the one who has the ability to build stable governments. So now you're starting to see this doctrine of superiority begins to take shape. Then it says, historians from the lofty academic towers of Oxford, like Bishop William Stubbs and Edward A. Freeman, expounded the Teutonic origins theory in British intellectual circles. It leaped the Atlantic and found lodging in the mind of Herbert Baxter Adams, one of the organizers of the graduate school at Johns Hopkins University and founder of the American Historical Association. He expanded Freeman's views by asserting that the Teutonic origins theory really had three homes: England, Germany, and the United States. Pretty soon, this distorted theory dominating the thinking of American historians at leading universities like Harvard, Cornell, Wisconsin, and Columbia. So this is one of the problems that I have even with some of these seminaries, is you have people who have ideologies that are not rooted in truth that are teaching young minds. And so if you have a distorted theology and a distorted theory of origin of people and humanity, and it's already rooted in supremacy, what do you think your students are going to have coming out of these seminaries? What do you think your students are going to have coming out of these seminaries? Just think about that. He goes on to say, even natural science, that discipline committed to the inductive method, creative appraisal, and detached objectivity, was invoked and distorted to give credence to a political position. So now you have the historians are involved in this lie, and now the natural scientists become involved in this lie. All right. A whole school of racial ethnologists developed using such terms as species, genus, and race. It became fashionable to think of the slave as a species of property. I'll say it again. It became fashionable to think of the slaves as a species of property. It was during this period that the word race came into fashion. Dr. Samuel G. Morton, a Philadelphia physician, emerged with the head size theory. So they began to, and I believe if Robert is on here, he can type in the name of that specific science where they tried to use the size of one's skull to determine one's intelligence, right? So he used the head size theory, which affirmed that the larger the skull, the superior the individual. The bogus science that was going on, all to justify treating someone inhumane. This theory was used by other ethnologists to prove that the large head size of Caucasians signified more intellectual capacity and more native worth. Phrenology, that's what it is. So they came up with this whole bogus science to say, well, if your skull is bigger, then you must be smarter. And you must have more value if your skull is bigger. All right. Dr. Josiah C. Knott, in his collections on the natural history of the Caucasian and Negro races, used pseudoscientific evidence to prove that the black man was little above the level of an ape. So when you see all of these kind of jokes and ideology centered around monkeys and apes, and even what was going on with the whole thing about Harambe, the gorilla or ape that got killed, and then you start seeing all these jokes about it. People need to understand that that is based in history. Awesome. I've heard of him, but I haven't seen this interview. All right. So you've got these theories talking about that black people are little more than the level of an ape. So if I treat you like a beast of burden, I'm quote unquote justified in treating you that way because I now have the false doctrines and I now have the quote unquote academia to back up my treatment of you, even if it's false. Okay. A Frenchman, Count Arthur de Gobineau, in his book, The Inequality of the Human Races, vigorously defends the theory of the inferiority of the black man and used the experience of the United States as his prime source of evidence. It was this kind of science that pervaded the atmosphere in the 19th century, and the pseudoscientists became the authoritative references for any and all seeking rationalization for the system of slavery. You still have white supremacists and white nationalists and just people who think that they're better than any other race or people of color that still use these false pseudoscience references and books to justify how they feel about black people. So even though this was in the past, the reality is there are people who still have this ideology going on in their brain. So even when they see someone shot in cold blood on video, they still go back to this. Well, you know, black people are violent, you know. He shouldn't have did it. It goes back to what is in your mind about Black America. And unfortunately, in the day that we live in, media is not helping. It's not. So we must create our own platforms. Let's continue reading. Generally, we think of white supremacist views as having their origins in the unlettered, underprivileged, poorer white classes. But the social obstetricians who presided at the birth of racist views in our country were from the aristocracy. It was the rich merchants, influential clergymen, men of medical science, historians, and political scientists from some of the leading universities of the nation. So MLK is making it very clear. These ideologies were not established by the poor whites. These ideologies in this country were established by the elites. They were established by the upper class. They were established by the wealthy and the affluent. They were established by people who knew better, but knowing better did not prevent them from creating a whole system of lies to justify the economy that they were making. Okay? With such a distinguished company of the elite working so assiduously to disseminate racist views, what was there to inspire poor, illiterate, unskilled white farmers to think otherwise? Because really, if you're supposed to be the best of my people group and I'm looking up to you, then what would make me think that what you're saying is not true? So if this is what you are saying about Black people and the origins of Black people, then I'm going to go along with, you know, the people who are supposed to be intelligent and degreed and wiser than me. I'm going to go along with that doctrine and that ideology. Exactly. People, and that's why I'm going over this. That's exactly why. Because people for generations have been under its control, Vincent, you're correct, and they have not been conscious of it. That's why we're having this discussion. Soon the doctrine of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook. It still is. Go read some of the textbooks. I was an educator in the classroom for 15 years. Go look at your present day textbooks and you will still see these doctrines and ideologies of white supremacy in your textbooks. That's why I tell parents, please review your textbooks, especially the history ones and the science ones. See what your child is learning. See what your child is learning about themselves and the world around them. And keep reading. So, soon the doctrine of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. This is why today you have people who are now in rebellion against the Christ. Because the reality is some of these churches were preaching white supremacy over the pulpit. So no, I can't get upset when people say Christianity is the white man's religion. I have to deal with the doctrines that made them come to that conclusion. I can't argue with them. I just have to give them the truth. And I have to say, this is how the gospel was twisted to state something about Black people that's not true. But here's the truth of the gospel. All right. So we have to give people the truth. And yes, we have to say that, yes, Christianity was twisted and used to give people a sense of superiority about themselves. That is the truth. So let's deal in truth. All right. It became a structural part of culture, and men then embraced this philosophy not as the rationalization of a lie, but also as the expression of a final truth. In 1857, the system of slavery was given its ultimate legal support by the Supreme Court of the United States in the Dred Scott decision, which affirmed that the Negro had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. Now, I have been on a couple of white supremacist sites, and they live by that statement, that the Negro has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. So there is a belief that I can do what I want to do to Black Americans in this country, and I'm not going to be punished for it. So how do we change that? How do we change that? We have to have people in office, and we have to have people in places like law enforcement that actually follow the law, that actually serve people as equal under the law, that actually punish people who violate the human rights of others, whether they're people of color, quote unquote, or not, you have to have people who will enforce the law and say, no, you're not above the law. You will be punished. And you will respect the civil and the human rights of everybody. Because if you don't have that, you're going to have more people coming out who feel like it's okay to not respect the rights of Black Americans or Latino Americans. He goes on to say, greatest blasphemy of the whole ugly process was that the white man ended up making God his partner in the exploitation of the Negro. I'll say that again. The greatest blasphemy of the whole ugly process was that the white man ended up making God his partner in the exploitation of the Negro. So you made God an accomplice in what you were doing that was ungodly. You tagged God's name on it and said, God is approving of this. So now, in my generation, we have a whole group of people that are turning away from the truth because you made God a partner in white supremacist era. What greater heresy has religion known? Ethical Christianity vanished and the moral nerve of religion was atrophied. This terrible distortion sullied the essential nature of Christianity, and it is still sullying it today. Virtually all of the founding fathers of our nation, even those who rose to the heights of the presidency, those whom we cherish as our authentic heroes, were so enmeshed in the ethos of slavery and white supremacy that not one ever emerged with a clear, unambiguous stand on Negro rights. Exactly. Hear what he just said. Out of our presidents that everybody loves, that some people worship, because that is ancestor worship. I don't care what you say. If you are so enamored with the founding fathers that you think they could do no wrong, that they had no error, that's ancestor worship. So don't tell me about what the Africans are doing and how they're worshiping Egypt. You got some ancestor worship going on too. But none of those presidents ever emerged with a clear, unambiguous stand on Negro rights. No human being is perfect, MLK writes. In our individual and collective lives, every expression of greatness is followed not by a period symbolizing completeness, but by a comma implying partialness. Following every affirmation of greatness is the conjunction but. Naaman was a great man, says the Old Testament, but that but reveals something tragic and disturbing, but he was a leper. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, John Quincy Adams, John Calhoun, and Abraham Lincoln were great men, but that but underscores the fact that not one of these men had a strong, unequivocal belief in the equality of the Black man. Now somebody is about to turn off this video right there because I just offended them about their founding fathers. But this is MLK's words. He's letting you know. Not one of these men had a strong, unequivocal belief in the equality of the Black man. No one doubts the valor and commitment that characterized George Washington's life. But to the end of his days, he maintained a posture of exclusionism toward the slave. He was a fourth-generation slaveholder. He only allowed Negroes to enter the Continental Army because His Majesty's Crown was attempting to recruit Negroes to the British cause. So it was not some altruistic reason of, oh, I feel that, you know, blacks are equal to us and let's put them in the war so they can fight. No, he just used strategy and said, I'm going to beat the British to it. Okay. Washington was not without his moments of torment. Those moments of conscience when something within him told him slavery was wrong. As he searched the future of America one day, he wrote to his nephew, I wish from my soul that the legislature of this state could see the policy of gradual abolition of slavery. It might prevent much future mischief. In spite of this, Washington never made a public statement condemning slavery. He could not pull away from the system. When he died, he owned or had on lease more than 160 slaves. Recently, this summer, we went to, I believe, one of the oldest synagogues in the United States. It was in Savannah. And as we were sitting there, we were listening to the tour. And one of the things that they were very proud of was the fact that the Jews who started this particular temple, they didn't own slaves, but they rented them. And they were proud of this distinction. We didn't own slaves, we just rented them. So we would rent them, and at the end of the day, we would drive them back over to where they lived, but we didn't own them. We just rented them. Blink, blink. So here in the life of the father of our nation, we can see the developing dilemma of white America, the haunting ambivalence, the intellectual and moral recognition that slavery is wrong, but the emotional tie to the system so deep and pervasive that it imposes an inflexible unwillingness to root it out. Thank you, Robert. Yeah. So morally, they know it's wrong. Intellectually, they began to justify it, but they had an emotional tie to what they were doing, and they were unwilling to root out this system. Thomas Jefferson reveals the same ambivalence. There is much in the life of Jefferson that can serve as a model for political leaders in every age. He came close to the ideal philosopher king that Plato dreamed of centuries ago. But in spite of this, Jefferson was a child of his culture who had been influenced by the pseudo-scientific and philosophical thought that rationalized slavery. In his Notes on Virginia, Jefferson portrayed the Negro as inferior to the white man in his endowments of body, mind, and imagination, although he observed that the Negro appeared to be superior at picking out tunes on the banjar. Jefferson's majestic words, all men are created equal, meant for him, as for many others, that all white men are created equal. Okay? Understand, when people go around quoting, all men are created equal, when that was established, it did not include black men. It did not include black people as human beings. At that point, black people were still considered a beast of burden. If you look on my Facebook page and go down a few posts, you'll see images where white men would sit on the backs of their slaves and be carried around. Okay, so it's not just a statement, beast of burden. This actually happened. Yet in his heart, Jefferson knew that slavery was wrong and that it degraded the white man's mind and soul. In the same Notes on Virginia, he wrote, "For if a slave can have a country in this world, It must be any other in preference to that in which he is born to live and labor for another. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The Almighty has no attribute which can take sides with us in such a contest. This is Jefferson writing and basically saying, if God is just, his justice cannot sleep forever. This is for the people that love Jefferson, that want to ignore what slavery and racism has done in our country and want to gloss over it and want to tell Black Americans to get over it. I will read it again. Jefferson says, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The Almighty has no attribute which can take sides with us in such a contest. And in 1820, 6 years before his death, he wrote these melancholy words. But the momentous question, slavery, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. I regret I am now to die in belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passion of their sons, and that my only consolation is to be that I live not to weep over it. This strange duality toward the Negro and slavery vexed the mind of Abraham Lincoln for many years. Few men in history have anchored their lives more deeply in moral conviction than Abraham Lincoln. But on the question of slavery, Lincoln's torments and vacillations were tenacious. Again, all you have to do is research, Google Abraham Lincoln's quotes on slavery, and you will see that Abraham Lincoln was indeed a white supremacist. Yeah. As early as 1837, as a state legislator, Lincoln referred to the injustice and impracticality of slavery. Later, he wrote of the physical differences between blacks and whites and made it clear that he felt whites were superior. At times, he concluded that the white man could not live with the Negro. This accounted for his conviction that the only answer to the problem, the Negro problem, was to colonize the black man, send him back to Africa or to the West Indies or some other isolated spot. The only problem with this is that all the black people that were here did not come over on a boat. There were some black people that were indigenous to America. They were here before Columbus. So you can't just start shipping people back to Africa. All right. In case you didn't know that. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. I got a call. This view was still in his mind toward the height of the Civil War. Delegation after delegation, the Quakers above all, great abolitionists like Charles Sumner, Horace Greeley, and William Lord Garrison pleaded with Lincoln to free the slaves, but he was firm in his resistance. Frederick Douglass, a Negro of towering grandeur, sound judgment, and militant initiative, sought without success to persuade Lincoln that slavery, not merely the preservation of the Union, was at the root of the war. At the time, Lincoln could not yet see it. A civil war raged within Lincoln's own soul, a tension between the Dr. Jekyll of freedom and the Mr. Hyde of slavery, a struggle like that of Plato's charioteer, with two headstrong horses, each pulling in different directions. Morally, Lincoln was for black emancipation, but emotionally, like most of his white contemporaries, he was for a long time unable to act in accordance with his conscience. But Lincoln was basically honest and willing to admit his confusion. He saw that the nation could not survive half slave and half free. And he said, if we could first know where we are and where we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. Fortunately for the nation, he finally came to see whether we were tending. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the Negro from the bondage of chattel slavery. Now, keep in mind, Lincoln did not free the slaves. He freed slaves in the South, not the North, and it was a strategic move to try to affect the economy of the South. So when people say Lincoln freed slaves, that's technically not true. All right. By this concrete act of courage, his reservations of the past were overshadowed. The conclusion of his search is embodied in these words. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. Honorable alike is what we give and what we preserve. The significance of the Emancipation Proclamation was described by Frederick Douglass in these words. Unquestionably, for weal or for woe, the 1st of January is to be the most memorable day in American annals. The 4th of July was great, but the 1st of January, when we consider it in all its relations and bearings, is incomparably greater. The one had respect to the mere political birth of a nation. The last concerns the national life and character, and is to be determined whether that life and character shall be glorious or infamously blackened forevermore. But underneath the ambivalence of white America toward the Negro still lurked with painful persistence. With all the beautiful promise that Douglass saw in the Emancipation Proclamation, he soon found that it left the Negro with only abstract freedom. Remember, he freed, you are free to go. He said, you are free to go to the slaves in the South. Had nothing to do with slavery in the North. And he did not control the slaves in the South at the time he released this Emancipation Proclamation. So blacks, of course, are given this abstract freedom. 4 million newly liberated slaves found themselves with no bread to eat, no land to cultivate, no shelter to cover their heads. It was like freeing a man who had been unjustly imprisoned for years, and on discovering his innocence, sending him out with no bus fare to get home, no suit to cover his body, no financial compensation to atone for his long years of incarceration and to help him get a sound footing in society. I'm going to come right back for my Facebook Live audience because now we're freezing. All right. Thank you again for my YouTube audience for bearing with me. All right, let's see if we can get this back up. All right, we are back on. Let's see if we can get our audience back up here. All right, I see some people coming back in. As I have said before, you can do a video on anything of non-importance on Facebook Live and it will never cut off. The moment we start talking about this subject, all of a sudden it cuts off. So we are on part 2. So I'm going to just give a moment for those who are watching to come back in, and I'm going to reiterate my last statement here. And we are nearing close. He goes on to say, welcome. This is actually the closing. So if you are just jumping on, make sure you go back and look at part 1. So we're talking about, and we're reading from, where do we go from here? Chaos or Community, MLK's Blueprint for Black America. And we're talking today about racist ideology and how that has shaped and played a part in American society that is still affecting us today. And we are now talking about the Emancipation Proclamation and what did it actually do, right? It didn't actually free all the slaves. Lincoln was very specific and very strategic in saying the slaves of the South are free. He didn't free the North. He freed the slaves in which at the time he had no control over, because that part of the Union was breaking off. All right. So he did it to affect the economy of the South in the hopes that the South would give in to the North. All right. So 4 million newly liberated slaves found themselves with no bread to eat, no land to cultivate, no shelter to cover their heads. It was like freeing a man who had been unjustly imprisoned for years, and on discovering his innocence, sending him out with no bus fare to get home, no suit to cover his body, no financial compensation to atone for his long years of incarceration and to help him get a sound footing in society, sending him out with only the assertion, now you are free. This is what was done to Black America. And to this day, we're still trying to catch up. The latest report on the wealth disparity in Black America says that it will take us 228 years to catch up to white wealth and where it is right now. 228 years. Why is that? Because of the economic deprivation that our ancestors in our generations endured. While other people were building wealth generationally, we were the wealth. We were the economy. We were the property. We talked about that yesterday. You couldn't be property and have property. So when people say, I don't understand, I just don't understand why Black people can't get ahead, I just don't understand why they're so far behind, that's why. And trying to get people in this country to understand, even with people who come in our country today and do well that are of other people groups, your ancestors were not commodity and property in this country. They were not the stock and bond. So we have to understand the context by which Blacks in America are behind. It was intentional. It was not a fluke. It was not an accident. All right? What greater injustice could society perpetuate? All the moral voices of the universe, all the codes of sound jurisprudence would rise up with condemnation at such an act. Yet this is exactly what America did to the Negro. In 1863, the Negro was given abstract freedom expressed in luminous rhetoric. But in an agrarian economy, he was given no land to make liberation concrete. So of all of the wealth, exactly. And they're also given benefits and loans and things that are not given to Black Americans. Just do your research. All right. But in an agrarian economy, an agricultural economy, he was given no land to make liberation concrete. So remember, Blacks coming out of slavery, the only kinds of jobs they were working were domestic and agricultural, because that was the system that they had been a part of. So if I've only been working a domestic job, like doing housework, or if I've only been working in the fields and planting, that's agricultural, then you give me no land and you give me no mules to start over with, which means now I am left skillless to go work in a new economy, because you're not giving me the tools to work in the economy in which I'm familiar with. So now, as he says here, after the war, the government granted white settlers without cost millions of acres of land in the West, thus providing America's new white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. So everyone has received welfare. So when we throw that out there and talk about other cultures, whites in America received welfare coming to this country. Let's be clear. They gave them an economic floor. Blacks in this country were not given an economic floor after slavery. All right. But at the same time, its oldest peasantry, the Negro, was denied everything but a legal status he could not use. He could not consolidate. He could not even defend his legal status. As Frederick Douglass came to say, emancipation granted the Negro freedom to hunger, freedom to winter amid the rains of heaven. Emancipation was freedom and famine at the same time. Think about that statement. Emancipation was freedom and famine at the same time. Yes, you are free. Free to hunger, free to thirst, free to struggle, but free to excel, not going to help you with that part. The inscription on the Statue of Liberty refers to America as the mother of exiles. The tragedy is that while America became the mother of her white exiles, she evinced no motherly concern or love for her exiles from Africa. It is no wonder that out of despair and estrangement, the Negro cries out in one of his sorrow songs, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." The marvel of all of this, as Frederick Douglass once said, is that Negroes are still alive. So we're going to stop there today. And just think about that, because we get a lot of conversation about what Black people in this country aren't doing. We get a lot of conversation about how they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but we don't get a lot of conversation about America shirking her responsibility from the very start. That you release a group of people and you basically release them into nothingness and said, fend for yourselves. So if we're going to talk about what Black America is not doing, we have to go back to what did white America do that set up a people group to continually struggle and struggle and struggle and struggle. Here's some homework for you. Go look up peonage. Peonage. Go look up the system of peonage, which came before Jim Crow laws. Go look up that system that began to, because they had millions of black people that they quote unquote released into freedom, but they didn't really give them help. They didn't give them an economic floor. So they had to figure out, what do we do now with these people that we have released? Well, we're going to set up peonage. And they began, because they had what people still call today the Negro problem. They began to criminalize the behaviors of black people. And as they criminalized their behavior, then it was easy to put them back into a form of slavery, which was prison. And then they used that prison population to build our railroads and to begin to take us into the what we call the Industrial Revolution, that was largely helped out by the prison population that they began to get by criminalizing these blacks who had just been freed. See how that works? So you're not really free if I tell you you're free and then I don't give you an economic flooring, because you were the economy, you were the money, you were our system of economy. So I don't give you an economic flooring because I'm ticked off about that. The fact that I can no longer use you as economy, I can no longer use you as property. So now I'm going to criminalize your behavior. I'm going to put you in jail. I'm going to put you on the chain gangs. And now you're going to help build this country. Peonage. Do some homework on that. All right, we will be back tomorrow. Where do we go from here? As I said, this book has been out of print for a decade. You can clearly see why. Because he's ruffling a lot of feathers here and just speaking some truth. And so we'll be back tomorrow with the continuation of this topic of white America and these practices of white supremacy. Tomorrow we're going to be looking at what happened with the Native American. We're going to be talking about disillusionment with these systems, and we're going to be talking about the challenges to America in dealing with this system. So I hope that you learned something today that you didn't know, and I hope that you got something out of today's reading and talk. And thank you again for your time. Thank you for watching live. Please feel free to share with your followers, and hopefully we will see you back tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care and God bless. All right. Thank you all as well for watching. Take care and God bless.